Hello, everyone. Thank you to Beth and to Dave for those opening remarks. And thank you to all of you for joining us today. Our goal for the discussion this afternoon is really to go kind of beyond the guidance. And as Beth and Dave have both raised, we're really at the point where we're working on implementation now. And this is really where the rubber meets the road. And as folks are kind of getting to know the policy, a lot of questions are coming up. And these questions really go beyond what does the guidance say and get much more into how does everyone understand the guidance together? How are we going to work together to actually implement this? And these questions go beyond just questions to OMB, but questions that stakeholders have for each other. So what we really wanted to do today is invite all these folks that have been here today to have this conversation together. And just to go ahead and get right into it, I think the first topic that we've received a number of questions on is the focus that you find throughout the guidance on internal controls. This was a huge priority for OMB, and I think one of the, and the COFAR, and one of the main themes that you see throughout, and what really allowed for a lot of the administrative flexibility that you see in the guidance, is a view that kind of lifts up from very prescriptive procedural policy requirements and instead provides guidance that recipients and non-federal entities are required to maintain strong internal controls within their own organizations. So I know we have gotten a lot of questions from folks about what exactly that means on the ground, and I'd like to turn it over to Kim Moreland to talk a little bit more about that.
Thank you so much, Victoria. Victoria asked me to say a little bit about where I'm from, which is the University of Wisconsin in Madison. It's a beautiful campus nestled among the lakes in Madison. We are often known for things like brats, craft beer, and yes, the best cheese on the planet. However, today we're going to focus on other aspects, including the continuing quest for academic excellence and the importance of scientific research in the future of Wisconsin and, yes, the country. So I would say that we were uniquely poised, perhaps, to think about internal controls at Madison because we have begun a 2-year initiative to examine all of our processes relating to internal controls. And then I found the December 26th release of the uniform guidance mentions internal controls repeatedly. I've never talked about internal controls in my life until this year. So I wanted to ask our friends in the audit community, how will you go about approaching the need for strong internal controls, both sort of as a background for our regulatory environment, but also as it applies to specific topics that are mentioned?
Well, Kim, I'll kick it off. I'm Mandy Nelson, and I'm with KPMG. I'm in our national office, and I oversee the technical side of audits relating to any type of public sector entity. And of course, one of the big things would be the single audit. But as we were talking, internal control and the need for it at recipients is not new. And it's not new that we, the auditors, are going to have to test internal control. We've had that responsibility in the single audit since the single audit started. So that's not new. But I think what you're talking about is the sudden kind of awareness that Section 303, the must, a sentence that has both must and internal control in it, certainly got people's attention. And yes, the should sentence, the ever popular should sentence, you know, that the internal control should involve COSO and the Green Book. And I know, Brett, you've been involved in working on the Green Book, so you have a lot of ties to it.
Right.
But let's clarify, what does should mean? Should doesn't mean must. Must means must. Yep.
Or is that true?
What?
What does should mean?
Should means that those documents are best practices. So if you think about, if you were going to go build something, like you're going to go build your internal control, you'd look for handbooks and things that help you. So you look to COSO, you look to the Green Book, and you say, what information can I get out of those documents? A lot of people put a lot of time actually, as you said, one of your professors spends his life talking about internal control. That's the people that wrote those documents, so why not look there and say, okay, they're good documents.
Could I ask Brett
And I
to
think
comment?
just to add in on that, and again, I'm Brett Baker. I'm the Assistant IG for Audit, National Science Foundation. We've got a tremendous interest in NSF and making sure that the grant programs are working the way that they can. Science, technology, engineering, math are a big deal. So getting into the should language and the must language, when we see terminology like the should outside of the uniform guidance, typically we'll see things referenced as presumptively mandatory. So you'll see that there's a certain procedure out there that it's anticipated that it was going to be actually executed, and if there is a reason to not do so, it has to be well documented. So, and then that's counter to what a best practice is. So it's a little bit more challenging, I think, from a standpoint of an institution, a recipient of federal funds, how to deal with that. I do a lot of speaking in the research community, and then I just spoke over the last couple of weeks at 2 different conferences, and that topic actually came up in each one of those sessions, or each one of those conferences I spoke at, and they're really looking for more insights, because it's going to take a lot of funding. For example, I know that we talked offline that you're building some new systems at Wisconsin, that if you're going to put some systems in place based on a best practice, it's going to be costly. Do you need to? Do you have to? And I think that's something that they're really grasping for out there, or grappling with out there in the should statement. So, I mean, they're more used to, in terms of other guidance, AICPA standards, the Green Book, there's the Yellow Book that we use for audit work. Should has a much more, I think, a stronger reference or inference.
So could I turn to Victoria, do you mind, and ask, maybe the most important question on the university side right now is the one regarding the FAQs and the preamble, because those documents clarified a great deal that we were confused about in the guidance, including the should versus must conversation.
Yep.
But will those carry the same weight as the uniform guidance does?
Yes, those do carry the weight of providing additional context to the O&B guidance that came out. Of course, the guidance itself is into C.F.R. 200. That's codified in the Code of Regulations. But, for example, when we put out the compliance supplement next year, the compliance supplement will reference both the preamble and the frequently asked questions, and that will be what gives auditors, for example, and non-federal entities that are recipients kind of the reference that they need to rely on those documents in interpreting the guidance going forward. I will say that we do anticipate that, you know, these additional documents are really provided as a roadmap as we kind of change from the state of the world where we had these old circulars and we all understood them and we sort of knew where the pitfalls were and what the big issues are, to now we have this new guidance, and in some cases we think we understand it, but we're not sure if the guy sitting across the table understands it the same way we do. And so that's why, A, we want to have conversations like the one we're having today, and we want to continue this conversation. But B, we have these additional documents that can kind of help us navigate that transition. And some of those questions about the effective dates and such, once it's effective, those questions will fall away and they won't be needed as much anymore. So it's not as permanent of a reference, but it does have weight. And one question that we've gotten a lot along those lines is if there's anything that we've seen into C.F.R. 200 since it's come out where the COFAR has realized, hey, we might have had an error there, it might have actually not communicated what we thought we communicated. We're taking that list of issues now, and the COFAR will take a very close look at that. And if there are any technical corrections that need to be made into C.F.R. 200 to the guidance itself, the COFAR anticipates making those changes at the same time that the draft reg implementing the guidance is published. So by the time it goes into effect, there should be one completely consistent set of guidance, and those additional reference documents will be available to rely on as well.
So if I were to go back to my friends in the audit community, it's so seldom I can ask auditors questions. Instead, they come and ask me questions. So I'm loving this. So assuming then that the FAQs and the preamble fall into the compliance circular, does that take care then of our interpretations that were expressed? So for example, the explanation that conflict of interest is not about scientific integrity, it has to do with financial transactions. Is that going to be audited based on the FAQs rather than on the original document only?
Well, as Victoria said, I know when I was looking at the draft 2015, that was one of the comments, is how many places can we incorporate references to the FAQ? Because, yeah, I mean, we've got to follow no, you can't hold us to different standards than you, so we'll make sure that it has a real place.
No, and I'd have to agree. I think all the various guidances out there in the uniform guidance, we're going to be looking at that closely and just making sure that it matches up with what we see on site. So, I mean, I have to agree with Andy.
That's very helpful. Then perhaps I could look at a specific issue as an example. So at Wisconsin, we have an electronic effort reporting system that we've had quite a while. It's been through a number of audits. It was very expensive to implement, and it is even more expensive to maintain in terms of the staffing, the involvement of our faculty. We certify 10,000 people twice a year. I have 500 effort coordinators on campus. The mechanism is huge. So if I read the uniform guidance and I look at its reliance on standards of documentation and on the application of adequate internal controls in relationship to effort reporting, can you help me understand what is the balance? How do I know that the standards I establish will meet a test that occurs later in an audit?
Well, there's clearly going to be a lot of judgment.
Yes.
So, you know, if on any given topic, if the three of us talked about it, we might have slightly different views of that. But, you know, one of the things we were talking about is before you decide that, you know, throw that system out the window and do something else, involve discussions, you know, involve your auditors, involve your agencies to make, you know, to have those discussions, and please do it at the design phase.
Oh, yes.
Let's not go to operating effectiveness tests before we start having these conversations. And, you know, one of the first things I'm going to ask you is, you know, as in your role, you're going to be signing certifications. You're going to be drawing funds down. So, you know, you're the first line. So how are you going to feel comfortable that those employees worked on that grant and that those charges advanced all the way up to the books and records that were used for the draw? So if I sit down and I talk to you and you're like, you know, I sleep perfectly. I sleep better than I do with my old system. You know, we're gonna go through those. And, you know, I might not use all the COSO terminology and things, but some of the underlying concepts there. How do you monitor it? How do you communicate your controls? All of those are going to be part of that conversation. Brett?
Right. I'd like to add on to that. I agree totally. What we're trying to do with effort reporting, when we take a look at it, we want to see assurances that the funds claim for federal funding purposes, they're actually used for the award, and then the system controls that you're using to actually process those transactions, can it actually trace back to valid support, some way to be able to get like an audit trail for that purpose. And then whether or not the certifier, the person that's actually attesting to that work that's being done, that there's clear knowledge of that work, and that we can tell that from an audit standpoint. And then, well, if we can tell that from an audit standpoint, managers within the institution can do that as well. So we're looking at that. We're looking for strong policies, procedures, system controls that are built in. I do like the reference of talking to your internal audit staff, just to get an insight on how system controls can be set up. I think internal audit is vitally important at institutions. I talk to folks in the internal audit staff every time I go out to a conference. I'm talking to them and getting their insight. That's a main area that they focus on, is effort reporting.
And if you're at a smaller entity that you don't have the internal audit, maybe you have a board member that you could sit down and have this discussion. If they're a board member from a public company,
That's right.
you know, they've lived and breathed internal controls quite a long time. So, you know, find somebody to have that conversation with. It's just, you know, planning.
I think that and those are all great statements, and we would take them to heart, but wouldn't you say actually the safest course of action would be to stay with a system that has been through a number of audits and wait as these policies and their interpretations are refined over the next couple of years?
Well, the whole idea was...
I hate to be conservative, but
Well,
it's
but
tempting.
It is tempting, but there's really nothing, there's nothing in the guidance that actually says all of those are blanket, you know, if you had this before, it's still fine. I mean, the question is still going to be asked, how do you sleep at night? You know, even if you don't change your system, that is going to be the question.
And that's a key point. Like, internal controls are really designed to help you do that, sleep at night, making sure that you have really good assurances, you're comfortable that you're using federal funds properly and you're charging it. In many awards in federal government, 60, sometimes even 70% of the funding's in effort reporting. So it's a big component of the charges to the federal government. So from our standpoint in the federal government, we want to make sure that the controls are in place. So we look at that so closely when we go out, and I know that in single audit, that's one of the main areas that you look at. Single audit is visibility, switch gears a little bit, is a visibility to the federal government, how institutions are complying with the various rules, terms, and conditions of the uniform guidance. In essence, are you using funding properly? You have controls in place. That's the underlying principle, overarching principle as well. Internal controls are so critically vital.
Right, because when you're saying, I might not have to do anything, well, but you are implementing the uniform guidance.
Oh,
and that
yes.
says internal control. So if you put in your system, I think, you said it was expensive, you said it did a little while ago, but now you're under this guidance, so you still have to take a fresh look at it and say, what are those controls? I bet when you put it in, the people that were in your IT department, the people who were the PIs on those, aren't necessarily the same people that went through the training, and I'm sure you spend a lot of time doing the training on that new system. But, over time, people change, your underlying computer system could have changed, so, how do you feel comfortable with the IT component? And, you're talking about something that we call management review control, where a PI looks at those timesheets or something. Do you, if I sat down with that PI and I said, what exactly would you consider to be an error? What are you looking for? To your point, how do you know that's what the person did? Those are the kind of, questions to just rethink.
And it is very tempting to get lost in a discussion of effort reporting, but I'm going to spare you that since we're really talking about internal control. So let me look at another example that is very simple, and that is perhaps one of the best things in the uniform guidance as it's being received by the faculty at Wisconsin is the idea that now computing devices under $5,000 are allowable as a direct cost. I mean, that's where they stand up and applaud when I talk about this. But for them to be allowable, they have to be essential and allocable. So to me, this is a perfect conundrum for internal controls. What does it mean to be essential and allocable? Does it mean that my faculty member bought it, so it must be necessary to do the work of this project? Or does it mean that my faculty member fills out a 2-page form justifying how that iPad relates to the research going on? Or can I hopefully find someplace in between? How do I make that determination?
Well, I think, you actually touched on it when you started your discussion on that it's really key to, does it make sense to, for those charges to be applied to the federal awards that you have? Those funds are critically important to ensure that for NSF awards, science, technology, engineering, and math is being advanced. I think it's clear from an audit standpoint, we want to be able to see that those charges in that device is actually something that makes sense to that award. So we're looking at it from that standpoint. Documentation helps us do that. We also just interacting with the various, the PIs and the various individuals working with that equipment, we can gain that understanding, that assurance.
Yeah, Brett used the word audit trail. How would a week from now, a year from now, somebody actually going to be able to answer that question?
Yes, but still answer that question and not devote so much time to it that it becomes another burden, which we're trying to obviate, obviously.
So in that regard, that's reasonable assurance, right? And that's essentially what internal controls provide you is reasonable assurance that, in this case, the equipment that is being charged to the federal government is being used for the appropriate purposes for the award. So we just want to gain that assurance. I know on single audit, you're looking at it from that standpoint.
Right. And, kind of the difference between the process of purchasing that versus the control to know that it was appropriately charged to that grant. The monitoring of it, communicating your policies. All of those are, we all think of signing off or filling out a form. But, if you've got an IT problem or, you don't continually train people, then all those forms aren't going to help. So that when we talk about internal control, it's more than the actual control activities. And that's one of the things I think if you just sat down and, I know, kind of amazing, but to read the Green Book or read COSO, you'd get that sense without having to say you had to do every one of the 17 principles.
Right.
But you'd kind of see where people are looking for controls.
Right, so the control environment, I think a lot of what we've been talking about is really, you're looking at from that standpoint. Do we have good tone at the top? Do we have policies, procedures, good structured approach? I mean, when auditors come in, we can see that pretty readily. It looks like a very solid process that we're looking at. Risk assessments, you do that regularly. I actually talked about that offline. We talked back in March, I think, a lot
Yes.
about that just understanding where your risks are, and then you apply controls appropriately. I think that makes sense. The control activities that Mandy mentioned, those are things that we're going to test. We test those extensively. There are more specific things that you want to be able to have in place to make sure that you're using federal funds appropriately. So we do pay attention to that, and the monitoring is so critically important.
Great, I think that's very helpful. And I'm happy to hear that we're thinking about these areas in the same way. Now, I do have the COSO cube printed and on my desk, just to remind me from time to time that, a little checklist, do I have a policy and procedure, and on down. But I know the control environment becomes particularly important, and the monitoring process. So we'll be concentrating on all of those.
We're going to turn it back to Victoria.
I think we could.
Yes, all right. Well, thank you, all three of you, very much. This was a really great dialogue, and I learned a lot, so thank you.